There were many factors that influenced the Islamic civilization. Next slide. Religious influences. In the Quran it says, "For whoever saves a life, it will be as if they have saved all of humanity." Quran 5:32. That was profound. And also in the Hadith it said, "There is no disease that God has created except that He has also created its treatment." Conversely, if you look at what was happening in Europe at that time, they felt the disease was a supernatural. It was a curse. It was something that they'd done wrong. They'd have to pray themselves out of it. But these verses told the Muslims, no, we need to go and find the answer, because the answer is there. There's other reasons for why we had the golden age of Islam, and it was a translation period. At this time, whenever an invading force came to an area, they'd kill all the intellectuals. Go over there, kill everything. But when the Muslims expanded, they invited people to come. And they translated large bodies of work, Greek, Syriac, Persian, Sanskrit. They went all over the place to get as much of the information as they could and get it translated into Arabic. They translated Plato, Aristotle, Hippocrates, who was known as the grandfather of medicine, Galen, who was known as the father of medicine. If you look at the Western world, they translated all their works. And they had such large libraries. One, the House of Wisdom, the Beit al-Hikmah, was the major intellectual center in Baghdad, up until 1258, when the Mongols came and invaded and sacked Baghdad. They say the Euphrates River went black from the ink of all the books that were thrown in the Euphrates River. That's how many books were thrown into that river. And the people crossed the river, that's how many books and texts were lost. And that was just one area. Also, government sponsorship. The budget for some translations, not all translations, some translations, was twice what the current budget is for the UK's Medical Research Council. Twice. In 2017, the budget for the UK was £814 million that they give. Or sorry, pounds. That's how much money that the Cadiz would put towards translation of texts. The Cadiz would send translators all over the known civilized world and try to find as many books as they could and try to standardize it. For the first time, you had these books, Sanskrit books, Syriac books, Persian books, all of them being translated into a single language, which had never been done before. And some of the translators were paid as much as 500 gold dinars a month. 1 dinar is about 4.25 grams. You can go on Google and check how much 4.2 grams of gold is nowadays, okay? It's a heck of a lot of money. And they were very open to diverse influences. It didn't matter where the information was coming from. When I talk about information, I'm not talking about medicine only, I'm talking about chemistry, science, physics, alchemy, astronomy, astrology, everything. They were just trying to seek as much knowledge as they could of the dunya. Probably the single most important discovery was paper, which was discovered by the Chinese. Before then, they used parchment, which paper was much easier to make than parchment. A papyrus, which was what the Egyptians used, that was more likely to crack. Paper also absorbed the ink better, so it's less likely to rub away over centuries and decades and centuries. And the Islamic paper makers, they had an assembly line method where they could just churn out copies and copies and copies of these books. And for the first time in history, a person could actually make a living by writing and selling books in this era. Prior to that, it was only the educated, the monks who could read and write. Now the average man could learn to read and write and make a living in the Islamic era. Before we had the Islamic hospitals, we'll talk about hospitals now that we had. They were simple, there was no organizational structure. If you look at Europe at that time, like I said before, they thought the diseases came because of supernatural reasons. And usually it was run by monks in their churches. And all they were kind of mainly focused on was the salvation of the soul. These people, they're ill, they're going to die, pray to God, and hopefully they'll go to heaven. Yeah. But with the Muslims, it was a lot different. One of the first things they had was mobile dispensaries. And was that the right one? Go back one. Mobile. Forward one. There we go. And the first Islamic care center was actually set up at the time of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, by Rufayda al-Aslamiyah, and where she set up a tent, to help treat the Muslims. But later rulers, they had traveling dispensaries where they had medicine, food, clothes, drinks, doctors and pharmacists, and they would travel to outlying areas to people and communities who weren't living in the cities. And in the reign of Muhammad Saljuki in the 12th century, his mobile hospital was so big they needed 40 camels just to carry everything with it. That's how big their mobile hospitals were. The first general hospital was built under the reign of Caliph Harun al-Rashid, and within a few decades, 34 hospitals sprang up in the Islamic world, and they continued to grow. They even had hospitals for prisoners. And this Ali ibn Isa, who was a vizier in the 10th century, actually noted, he was worried that there were so many prisoners in prison, and that if they got sick, it spread. They didn't understand microbiology or germs, but they understood plagues and how things spread, and that they have to have their own healthcare system. And so then from there on, even the prisons had their own hospitals. Next slide. And this was a really interesting letter, and I'm going to ask the kids or whoever to listen to the letter, and I want you to pick out some key points from there for learning, right? So this is a Frenchman who was in Cordoba Hospital. Cordoba was under the Muslims, southern Spain, in the 10th century. He was writing to his father, and he says, "You have mentioned in your previous letter that you would like to send me some money to make use of it in my medicine costs. I say I don't need it at all, because as the treatment in this Islamic hospital is free. Also, there is something else concerning this hospital. This hospital gives a new suit and 5 dinars to every patient who has already got well, lest he should find himself obliged to work in a period of rest and recuperation." What points would you bring up from that? Sorry? Community services. Anything else from there? Free? Anything else? Sorry? And where is the father from? That's a good point. That wasn't even in my slide. That's a very good point. France. So in medieval Europe, it cost, didn't it? So we talk about free, and we also, from just this letter, we know that in the non-Muslim areas, healthcare wasn't free. Anything else that we don't even have in this NHS system here? Huh? Staff, yeah. Anything else? New suit and 5 dinars. The Muslims, they knew that these patients were ill. Once they recovered, they may not be able to go back to work. There wasn't a benefit system like they have here. You can get a sick note from your doctor. So they would actually give you money, so you at least had some time to fully recover before you could go back and go out to work. Something you don't have in this country. Next slide, that's it. The letter carries on. There'll be more questions coming. "Dear Father, if you'd like to visit me, you'll find me in the surgery department and joint treatment. When you enter the main gate, go to the south hall where you'll find the department of first aid and the department of disease diagnosis. Then you will find the department of arthritis. Next to my room, you will find a library and a hall where doctors meet together to listen to the lectures given by professors. Also, this hall is used for reading. The gynecology department lies on the other side of the hospital court. Men are not allowed to enter it. On the right of the hospital lies a large hall for those who recovered. In this place, they spend a period of rest for some days. This hall contains a special library." Anything else you can learn from this hospital in Cordoba? It's like this one's a long slide. I'll give you a bit more time to read it. What's he describing here? Surgery department, joint treatment, first aid, disease diagnosis. Different departments, different specialities. They had this 1,000 years ago. It didn't start in the NHS. You know, they talked about a library and hall where doctors meet together to listen to lectures. So there's a form of medical education here. Yeah, they had separate departments for female medical problems. Yeah, gynecology departments, and they also had recuperation areas and special libraries for patients to recover in. Yeah, next slide. This is the last part of the letter. Dear Father, any place in this hospital is extremely clean. Beds and pillows are covered with fine Damascus white cloth. As to bed covers, they're made a gentle, soft plush. All the rooms in this hospital are supplied with clean water. This water is carried to the rooms via pipes. Remember, we're talking about 800, 900, 1000 AD, yeah? And it's connected to a wide water fountain. Not only that, every room is equipped with a heating stove. As to the food, chicken and vegetables are always served, such that patients do not want to leave the hospital because of their love and desire of this tasty food. Advanced, yeah. Does it sound like an NHS hospital? do you eat the food in an NHS hospital? Yeah. It's very luxurious, isn't it? It's sounding very luxurious.
Especially 8, 9 centuries ago.
Sorry?
You know, especially about 98 or 9 centuries ago.
Yeah. Well, even now it's luxurious. It sounds like a private hospital to me. Yeah. And also, look, they have hot and cold water running into the rooms, you know? So, 1,000 years ago we're talking about here. Next slide. And so, as we mentioned in that letter, different departments. You had surgery, you had ophthalmology, which is the study of the eyes. You had orthopedics, bones, mental health. The physicians, the doctors work on fixed hours, and you had their own pharmacists and nurses. The salaries were fixed by law. It was free. And we talk about the religious influences, but we know in Islam the concept of giving sadaqah. Yeah. So you've got your zakat and you've got your voluntary wealth that you can give away. And the wealthy would give large sums of money to this. Yeah? Because it was their way of gaining sawab. So again, Islam still had a big influence on this. As well as the state's budget would also pay towards these big projects. They were open 24 hours. We mentioned that women were seen separately. They had outpatient clinics for less serious cases. Each patient who was an inpatient had their own hospital clothes. There were people who checked the cleanliness of the area. They were put on a fixed diet. And on discharge, they were checked to make sure that they could eat what a normal person would eat. So what a normal person would eat, bread and chicken. And if they could do that, they were deemed fit enough to be discharged. And also, we talked about how nice these hospitals were, and in the 17th century, Dr. Abdul Latif narrates a story which I found really funny when I was researching it. There's a youth who really wanted to go in the hospital. The doctor knew what he was doing, but he wasn't that unwell. So he went into the hospital and let him stay for 3 days. But on the 4th day, he said, Arab hospitality will last 3 days, I get out. They let him stay in the hospital for the first 3 days, even though he knew he was making up his symptoms. That's how nice these hospitals were. Next slide. In the book Ma'arif al-Qurba, they have the first concept of compensation and medical ethics was described in these lectures. If a patient was cured, the physician is paid. So I said the hospitals were free, but sometimes the doctors could charge. Yeah. But if a patient died, the patient could go to the chief medical officer. The chief medical officer would check everything, what prescription was given, how the patient was treated. And if he felt that there was no fault, they'd say that this was a natural death. But if there was fault, the doctor himself would have to pay blood money back to the family. So it's the first concept of clinical negligence and also compensation was found in the Islamic law. Next slide. And we talked about the medical school type education, you know. The hospitals trained the physicians, they had big lecture theatres. The medical students would follow the senior doctors around to learn, like they do ward rounds today, they would do ward rounds then as well. And on an examination, like a PhD, you have to write an essay in a PhD, you then have to have an interview with your professor who then drills you, you know, asks you all these questions. And you have to do the same thing, but something that was really different here was that you were encouraged to look for errors in previous works. Doesn't matter how big the medical professor was, how big, you know, their following was, you looked for errors so that you could improve. And this is how Islamic medicine really became amazing, was because you were asked to check what the teacher, their teacher was teaching, and was it actually right or not. And we know medical knowledge changes all the time. We learn new things and we advance all the time. And just one hospital in Egypt had 100,000 books. And at the same time, the biggest university in Paris, the University of Paris, only had 400 books. And I'm just talking about one hospital. I'm not even talking about the data they come. So you can see how much work they did. So finally, we're going to talk about some historical Muslim doctors. Yeah? In brackets, I've put down what the West call them, the Latinized way, but I refuse to use that. We should use the Arabic name, and there's a reason for why they use the Latinized name that hopefully will become clearer later on. Ibn Sina was born in 980 AD, memorized the Quran at age 10, was a doctor by age 17. Even with all my knowledge, even all the technology that I've got, I can't be a doctor by the age of 17. And other than medicine, these physicians wrote about everything, all types of science. But one of his was the philosophy and theology, and his paper on the proof of the truthfulness was felt one of the greatest medieval arguments for God's existence. And he was known as a prince of physicians. He wrote this book, Al-Noor. If you look at now, whenever new research comes out, within 6 months it's obsolete. We've got new research, we've got new evidence, we've got new information, you know. It never stays for that long. His book lasted for 700 years as the most important medical textbook used throughout medieval Europe, throughout the Muslim world. And what the Europeans would do is they would translate it into Latin. But they would never say Ibn Sina, they'd say Avicenna. Just this one book, there was 5 sections. They looked at just the basic medical principles of the anatomy in book 1. Listed all the different types of medical substances in book 2. Book 3 just looked at one body part of diseases. And book 4 looked at those conditions that would affect more than one area of your body. And book 5 was the drug remedy. So this is just go back, sorry. So the top picture is just the quality of how they would write their books, and it was there's lots of diagrams, color. So that's an original of the first page of the Al-Noor, and this is the Latin translation of this book now. I think it's in a university in America, still available to see. We've had the pandemic recently, lots of fake news, lots of trials and things like that, you know, and data and all this type of thing. But when it comes to drugs, Ibn Sina laid the foundation for pharmacology. And I'll just slowly go through this, right? One of his rules was that if a drug is tested, because a drug must be tested, he said, because sometimes you can give someone something and it's because of the drug, and other times it's because they would have naturally got better. And there's lots of people who go, oh, well, this is going to cure you, this is going to cure you, but it's by chance. Yeah? He also said that you should check the time of action must be observed, because again, you give a drug, but it's actually not the drug that's got you better, it's some other reason. And this is probably the most important bit, but that's still used in all medical trials to this day, is that you must see the effect of the drug, if not in all cases, in most cases. You know, it's no good saying that it worked on this person, therefore it's going to work on everybody. No, you have to prove that this medicine is going to work in most people. And also, you have to make sure that it works on the human body. There's no point in testing on an animal, as they do these days. They first test things on an animal before they test it on a human being, before they bring the drug out to the market. He said, don't use any drugs just because you test it on an animal and it seems to help with pain or it seems to help with fever. Use it make sure it works on the human body. Next slide. Al-Razi was born in 864, known as the father of pediatrics. He was the first one in history to distinguish between smallpox and measles. Never been written. And we're talking about big scholars. The Western world still follow like Galen and Hippocrates. They're right at the top when we talk about historical figures. This one, he was the first one to distinguish between smallpox and measles. Not even Galen or Hippocrates did that. And many scholars at the time argued that he was probably one of the greatest medical doctors in the medieval age. Even better than Ibn Sina. He had a lot of ethics about him. He broke down rules. He attacked fake doctors. He even warned that no matter how knowledgeable a doctor is, they can't always cure everything. So don't believe them when they say we can cure anything. He advised that we need to continue to study. And he said that there is a difference between some conditions you can cure, other conditions you can't. Next slide. And his books, he wrote so many books. First one, Kitab al-Hawi, had 23 volumes. With it, obstetrics, gynecology, how women give birth, eyes. He also had a virtuous life, but he also was the first doctor to publish a book for the average person to have at home, especially the poor and the traveller, and to learn how to manage simple conditions yourself. It was the first time in history that kind of book was ever published. Next slide. For gout, anyone know what gout is? It's really swollen, painful joints. Some of our elders might know it, they may suffer with it, right? He advised colchicum. And the active ingredient of that is colchicine. I still prescribe that for gout. The most effective treatment for gout. One of the most effective treatments for gout is colchicine. He was the first one to describe that over 1,000 years ago. First one to use an antiseptic. First one to start using anesthetic to try and make people drowsy before he operated on them. First to discover asthma. He realized, first one to discover that fever, even to this day, the fever, people go, I have to bring my fever down. The temperature's gone too high. I'm ill. But we know that a fever is natural, a way that your body fights infection. He was the first one to do that. As well as stated that some nerves are for moving, and some nerves are for feeling, sensory. But he was very famous for how he built a hospital. He was asked to build a hospital in Baghdad. And what he did was he placed meat all around the city. A few days later, he came back, and where the meat rotted the least, he said, this is where I'm going to build the hospital. Because there's something in this area that's cleaner than the rest of the city. Now, he didn't understand microbiology or germs. That came 400 later when you had microscopes, you could see. But he understood there was something there that made it cleaner. He presumed it was the air, but what we know is that it was cleaner because there's less bacteria, less dirt, less sewage, less, it was just a cleaner area. Yeah? And that there was something in the other areas that was making that meat rot faster. And he understood that that's bad to have sick people there. Yeah. We're almost near the end. It is a long talk. So Al-Zahrawi, I'm trying my best not to use his Latin name. So 936 AD, father of modern surgery. His Kitab al-Taslif was 30 volumes. And the surgery chapter was used for 500 years as the most preeminent surgical textbook in the known civilized world. He used catgut for stitches, which is still used to this day. Because he found that internally, when he stitched up, they would stay there and then they would dissolve, and the body would accept it. Yeah? He invented an instrument that you could put into your bladder to crush a bladder stone so it could be passed out. He did not need to cut the body open. How he did that, I don't know, because these days you need a camera to look where you're going, and you go into the bladder to crush the stone, but he produced an instrument for that. He had over 200 surgical instruments, and still to this day, 1,000 years later, most of his tools are still adapted and still used in surgical theatres to this day. But no one ever gives him the credit. This is the last one I want to talk about, because this to me was the most interesting and probably the least famous of all the medical doctors, was Ibn al-Nafis. And he, for me, was the father of circulation, how the blood travels around the body. If you look at typing circulation, history of circulation, this man, William Harvey, 1628, he's credited. Even now, he's credited with the discovery. We talk about Galen. Galen, I said, was the father of medicine. He's a Greek man. And he was literally, his textbooks were used all the time until the Muslims came. And even though the Muslims had such good textbooks, a lot of people in the West still use Galen. What he said was that the blood is formed in the liver. Just formed in the liver. And it goes up and down. And it'll come into the right side of the heart, and somehow it will move between the heart to this side, to the left side, and then air will come and mix. And then it'll go into the tissues, and in the tissues it'll disappear. And new blood comes back from the liver. That's what a lot of people believed, even in the Muslim world, initially. Go back. Even in the Muslim world, up until Ibn Nafis came along. And it's only recently that we found his books 100 years ago that he discovered how the heart and lungs work. What we know is that blood that's got no oxygen comes in this side of the heart, the right side. It then goes into the lungs, it then gets oxygen, comes back into the left side, beats, and then goes around to the rest of the body, and then comes back again. That's what we know now. So Ibn Nafis said Galen was wrong. There's no special holes here where the blood goes back and forth. He said that the blood leaves this side, comes up to the lungs, and it mixes with the air. And he didn't know about these small blood vessels because they're tiny. He didn't have microscopes. But he said that there must be something. There must be communication between this and this. Has to be. So he was one of the first to also talk about capillaries. He was also the first person, again not credited with this, of how the heart got its blood. So what they all thought up until William Harvey, whatever his name was, in the 1600s was that when the heart comes to the right, when the blood comes to the right side of the heart, it gets all this energy and nutrients and oxygen when it comes in. And logically you think blood's gone into the heart, it's pumping around, but it must also get this energy that way as well. But what Ibn Nafis said was that no, that's not right. When it leaves the heart, the blood, then it comes into its own connection. This is how we get heart attacks, because these blood vessels become blocked. That's how you have a heart attack, yeah? But so he was the first person to describe what we call the coronary circulation. But to this day, he never gets the credit, even though we've got the books to prove. Books that were found written by him in Latin in the Western libraries in 1930, his old books from 400 years' time. You know, and some scholars even think that what these Western scholars did was, in the 1700s, was they copied the Muslims' works and then credited themselves with the information. Yeah? Because a lot of the time it was word for word exactly the same translation in that. So, in conclusion, I'm sorry it was a long talk, but in conclusion, the Islamic Golden Age was a pinnacle of Muslim achievement. You know, there was advances in science, not just medicine. and it still influences the modern world today. So we need to learn our history, and more importantly, we need to break away from an inferiority complex. Sometimes it's not that the West think they're superior to us, we ourselves think that we're inferior to them. Yeah? We believe the narrative that they built this, they built that, they did this, and they educated us, they did this. But we need to realize that sometimes it's our own fault why we went from there down to here. Yeah? And if our ancestors could be up here, then maybe we should also try to get up there as well. So my thing to the youth is, be the best you can in whatever you do. I'm not saying I want all doctors. If you do business, be the best. If you want to do engineering, be the best. If you want to do research, be the best. You know, whatever you want to do, just try and be the best, because that's what the Muslims did before. Yeah? That's my thought. Thank you. Thanks for listening.
Is there any question in another?
Does anyone have any questions? You can ask, inshallah. Does anyone want to ask anything? Kasim is here, inshallah. So, mashallah, it was amazing. And we'll just stand up, inshallah, recite a few words of salam. Inshallah,